Hello there, my sleep fellows. Tonight, I invite you to rest your head and let your thoughts gently drift into the heart of the wizarding world, where the candles flicker without wind, staircases change direction at will, and quiet secrets rest behind ancient stone walls. This is a story whispered only after hours, long after the portraits have closed their eyes and the castle has settled into its midnight breath. Tonight's tale is not about battles or dark curses, nor about the great heroics we so often hear. Instead, it is about something smaller, quieter, yet just as magical. It is about an old chessboard, forgotten in a dusty corner of the castle, and the boy who once beat a full-grown set of enchanted chessmen without flinching. But you see, not all games truly end when they do. Some continue, hidden in the corners of time, and some wait to be played again. So let your body relax as we begin. Perhaps you are curled up beneath your blanket, or maybe lying still beneath the stars, listening with your heart open to wonder. Wherever you are, this gentle journey will carry you not with broomsticks or charms, but with the quiet strength of stories. Let us return to a familiar place, to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, on a peaceful evening just as the autumn leaves begin to turn. Outside, the sun has dipped below the forbidden forest, leaving behind a curtain of lavender and silver across the sky. The castle glows softly from within, golden windows reflecting on the black waters of the lake. Inside, the halls are hushed. Only the faint sound of moving staircases and distant laughter from the kitchens stir the silence. The Gryffindor common room is still. Its fireplace crackles low and steady, casting long shadows across the stone walls and overstuffed armchairs. The portraits snooze gently in their frames. A single chessboard rests on the small table near the window, its pieces unmoved, or so it seems. From here, the journey begins. A tale not of danger, but of gentle curiosity, of rediscovery, of a boy with red hair and a grin full of mischief, and the game he thought he had won long ago. And if you find yourself smiling or wondering what might lie ahead, I invite you to gently like this story, or follow along for more tales like this one. We'll always keep a candle burning for you here. Now, shall we begin? There, in the warm flicker of Gryffindor's hearth, sat Ron Weasley, draped comfortably in his favorite maroon jumper, slightly stretched at the sleeves and smelling faintly of treacle tart and wood smoke. His legs were folded beneath him on the old common room couch, his back resting against a faded red cushion embroidered with the lion crest. The firelight danced in his tousled red hair, giving him a soft halo, while his wand, tucked absent-mindedly behind one ear, swayed with each relaxed breath. Ron had grown, of course. The war was behind them now. Hogwarts had been rebuilt, and though the shadows of the past lingered in certain corridors, peace had returned like spring after a long winter. He had returned to the castle not as a student, but as a quiet kind of guest, helping Professor McGonagall with a few protective enchantments, enjoying the nostalgia, and sleeping in a room that felt like a memory wrapped in velvet. Harry and Hermione were elsewhere for the weekend, visiting the ministry. Luna had left a note pinned with mistletoe to his door. Even Neville was away, off on one of his herbology trips deep into the greenhouses. So Ron had the castle almost to himself, which was a rare and comforting thing. He looked out the common room window, watching the enchanted ceiling above the courtyard shift into a field of stars. His hand lazily reached for the mug beside him, still warm with cocoa, a floating marshmallow gently turning like a tiny cloud. And near his feet, Crookshanks, who now preferred Ron's lap to anyone else's, stretched and purred softly, then dozed off again. Ron had always been known for his loyalty, for his humor, for standing tall even when he felt small. But tonight, alone in this soft evening stillness, he felt a gentle tug of something he couldn't name. Not fear, not excitement, just curiosity. As if something old and unfinished had stirred, and it wasn't just the faint creak of the floorboards or the sighing portraits on the wall. Beside the fireplace, pushed back slightly under a side table, sat a wooden box. Not new, not polished, its corners chipped, its lid carved with swirling patterns of faded runes. He didn't remember seeing it there before. But then again, Hogwarts had a way of revealing things when it wanted to. Ron set his mug down and leaned forward slowly. Not out of urgency, but out of that quiet kind of wonder you feel when something forgotten gently wells your name. That was Ron Weasley now, older, softer, still wonderfully himself. Still the boy who had once stood bravely before a full-size chessboard and played a game of life and danger. But tonight, all he wanted was a quiet evening. Yet Hogwarts had other plans. Ron knelt by the old wooden box, its surface rough beneath his fingertips. The faint glow of the common room fire didn't quite reach its edges, casting it in a pocket of soft shadow. The carved runes along the lid shimmered ever so slightly, as if not fully awake, but gently aware. Ron tilted his head and furrowed his brow. Definitely wasn't here this morning, he murmured to Crookshanks, who responded only with the faintest twitch of a tail. He gave the box a soft push with one finger. It didn't budge. Then he tried lifting it, but it wouldn't move at all, like it had rooted itself to the castle floor. Strange, not alarming, just peculiar in that way only Hogwarts could be. Familiar walls hid unfamiliar mysteries, and Ron had learned long ago that curiosity was the first step into most magical surprises. He sat cross-legged in front of it now, much like he used to during Christmas holidays when opening gifts from his mum. The carvings weren't just decoration, they were chess motifs, kings and rooks, bishops and knights, all etched with surprising delicacy, frozen mid-motion as if captured in the middle of an ancient game. A soft breeze stirred the tapestries on the wall, though no windows were open. It passed through the common room like a sigh. Ron tapped his wand against the box's lid. Alohomora. A light click. The lock vanished, not with a flash, but like a forgotten breath being released. The lid creaked open by itself, revealing not an array of pieces or a folded game board, but a single folded cloth, midnight blue, embroidered with tiny silver squares. Gently, almost reverently, Ron lifted it. As he unfolded the cloth onto the nearby table, the enchanted chessboard beneath it shimmered into view. It was unlike any wizard's chessboard Ron had ever seen. Instead of the usual alternating black and white, the squares were deep tones of sapphire and charcoal, shifting gently like moonlit waves. The border was rimmed with silver trim, and at each corner rested a symbol, a rune he didn't recognize. But even more curious, there were no pieces on the board. That is, until he blinked. In the blink of an eye, the pieces appeared, not with a clang or pop, but with a hushed arrival, like actors stepping onto a silent stage. They weren't the chunky stone pieces Ron was used to from the school's set. These were delicate, ornate, and old, carved of ivory and obsidian, detailed with tiny expressions on their faces. The knight's horse bowed slightly. The queen stood tall with her scepter, and the pawns, small though they were, looked worn and noble, like soldiers who had played this game more than once. Ron didn't touch them. He simply stared, heart steady, thoughts turning. Then, without warning, the White King moved, one square forward, on its own. Click. The sound was soft, but final. Ron's eyes widened. No way. The chessboard shimmered. Its edge glowed faintly. Then the black pawn responded, stepping forward in perfect, silent retaliation. Ron looked around. The fire crackled. The common room remained as cozy and untouched as ever. No portrait stirred, no ghost drifted by. Crookshanks was curled on his side, still dozing. Everything felt safe. Still, a strange sensation pressed into Ron's chest, a memory perhaps, of a much younger version of himself, standing atop that massive living chessboard in his first year, sacrificing himself so Harry and Hermione could move on. That game had been real, tangible, dangerous. This was something subtler. Drawn in despite himself, Ron sat at the table, facing the board. The pieces shimmered again, waiting. And then, slowly, as if time itself adjusted to accommodate the rhythm of the game, Ron lifted his hand and moved a white bishop diagonally. The piece went with a graceful glide, like a whisper across silk. As it landed, a gentle bell-like tone rang through the room. Ron blinked. The room shimmered, and suddenly, it wasn't quite the Gryffindor common room anymore. It looked the same, the furniture, the rugs, the fireplace, but something in the air had shifted. The shadows had softened. The flames had grown steadier, less chaotic. The sound of wind outside the windows had faded into perfect stillness. Crookshanks was gone, and the portrait of Fat Lady. Her frame was empty. Ron stood up slowly, heart gently thudding, not in panic, but in focused wonder. The chessboard remained where it was, unchanged, as if nothing had happened, but Ron's hand hovered in the air, unsure what to reach for, his wand or another chess piece. Before he could choose, the Black Knight moved, and the floor beneath the table pulsed like a heartbeat, muffled beneath centuries of stone. Okay then, he whispered to himself. Looks like I'm in the game now. Not trapped, not even really pulled in, but included, as if the game recognized him. Another piece moved, and with it, another detail in the room shifted. The fireplace tiles, once plain, now bore patterns. The cushions shimmered with new embroidery. old family crests that had long since vanished from Hogwarts' memory. The chessboard was pulling time around itself like a blanket, stitching a different version of the room into place with each calculated move. Ron took a breath. It wasn't frightening. It was peaceful. Strange, yes. Magical, absolutely. But not threatening. He stepped back to the board and waited. The game was playing itself now. White moved, then black. Every move brought a subtle change. A chair turned antique. A candle became a floating orb. The sky outside the windows darkened into velvet twilight with no stars, only the soft shimmer of distant magic. Ron sat again. The game was a loop, not meant to win, not meant to lose. It was telling a story, a long-forgotten game meant to be played not for glory, but to remember, to observe. And so Ron stayed, letting the pieces move as they would, answering when it was his turn. Sometimes the board responded immediately. Other times it paused, as if waiting for the castle itself to approve the move. An hour passed, or perhaps a minute. Time was gently folding around him like a soft blanket. At one point, he reached for the knight, only to find a different version of himself, etched into the piece's base, like a memory. It wasn't scary. It felt like being wrapped in a dream. Somewhere, faint music began to play, slow, wordless, like the kind that echoes down long hallways when no one is awake, and the runes on the edge of the board shimmered again. Ron leaned forward, eyes heavy with wonder. The game was just beginning, and yet he had already been playing it his whole life. The air in the common room had grown still, so still it seemed time itself had slowed to a thoughtful pause. Outside the windows, the sky remained locked in a deep twilight, neither dusk nor dawn, just an everlasting in-between, wrapped in soft blue velvet. Ron sat silently at the enchanted chessboard, his fingers lightly touching the edge, as though it might speak again if given the right moment. The board hadn't moved in a while now. The last piece, a black queen, had glided forward in a bold but silent attack, capturing one of Ron's pawns. But instead of triggering the next expected move, everything had fallen still. The chess pieces shimmered faintly under the glow of the common room fire, but they made no sound, no twitch, no shift. They simply waited. Ron tilted his head. He'd half expected the room to snap back to its usual state by now. Maybe Crookshanks would come padding back across the rug. Maybe the fat lady would reappear, humming lightly in her frame. But neither came. Instead, something else arrived. From behind the fireplace, a faint clicking noise began. Subtle at first, like the tapping of long-forgotten typewriter keys in a room full of dust. Then, with no wind, no hands, and no visible force, one of the chessboard's silver corner runes began to glow more brightly than the others. A shimmer of pale lavender light crept along the edge of the board, curling like mist, then stretched outward, tracing a line toward the far bookshelf. Ron turned slowly, every movement soft and deliberate. The glowing line reached the shelf and paused in front of an old, untouched book, its spine unmarked, its leather cover cracked like dry earth. Then, gently, the book shifted. not fell, not floated, shifted as if it had been chosen. With a subtle hum, it lifted an inch from the shelf, hovered toward Ron, and laid itself neatly beside the chessboard, as if it had been invited. Ron looked down at it. The title was written in ancient runes, impossible to read, but something about it tugged at the edges of his memory. He reached out and, with a whisper of old pages, opened it. Inside, the pages were not filled with writing. They were filled with maps, tiny, intricate diagrams, grids of squares, names of lost places, positions of pawns and kings and knights. Not battles, but timelines. Each map marked the positions of chess pieces from long past games. Each square glowed faintly, and beside some were small sketches of people, wizards and witches, sometimes smiling, sometimes serious. And at the bottom of one page, drawn carefully in ink, was the unmistakable face of Ron Weasley. Not as he was now, but younger. First-year Ron. His face drawn in soft charcoal lines, determined, cautious, brave. Beside him was a sketch of a rook, a piece he'd sacrificed in his very first great game. Ron's breath caught. His heartbeat didn't race, but it pulsed like a soft drum in a calm forest. This was a record of every magical chess game ever played within the castle, not just for competition, not just for fun, but for memory. It was as if the board and the book worked together, not as a trap, but as a kind of quiet keeper of magical timelines. He flipped to another page. There, in soft silver lines, was a different map, one he didn't recognize. A board with strange square arrangements, twisted like a spiral. At its center, a black square with no name. And within that square, drawn not with ink, but with something like starlight, was the same chessboard he sat before now. A game inside a game. Ron blinked slowly, and then something whispered, not in words, not in any language, but in sensation. A cool breeze, a flicker of candlelight, a shift in gravity. Ron turned. The common room door, the one leading toward the dormitory corridor, was slightly open. That wasn't unusual, except now, instead of stairs, there was a long corridor of marble tiles lit with floating candles. One of the candles drifted closer, then paused, as if waiting. He stood, quietly. The chessboard remained behind him, but the book hovered in the air and followed. He stepped into the corridor. It was silent, yet not empty. The soft echoes of steps, his own, bounced gently off the stone. Portraits lined the walls, but all their inhabitants were asleep. Not pretending, not watching, deeply, restfully asleep. He passed a window, and outside he saw not the castle grounds, but something far older, a sea of fog and silver lights. Tall towers, broken by time, and in the distance, a giant rook made of stone, half buried in vines. The corridor opened into a chamber he didn't recognize, a circular room with a domed ceiling painted like a chessboard, stars twinkling within each square. At the center of the room stood another chessboard, smaller, carved directly into the floor. But this one was different. It was unfinished. Some squares glowed brightly, others were empty, as though waiting for their turn in the story. In the center stood a lone figure, tall, robed in gray, with their face hidden by the hood. Ron hesitated. The figure turned. There was no fear, no threat, just a deep calm, like watching the tide come in at the edge of a familiar lake. The figure lifted a hand and pointed to the board. Ron stepped closer. The pieces were moving on their own again. The game was continuing. Not the one on the table, but a larger game, one that stretched beyond rooms and years. As he watched, a familiar piece moved, a knight, carved just like the one he'd seen on the enchanted board. But this time, when it moved, a square on the wall lit up. A memory stirred. Something Hermione had once said about how old magic sometimes lived in games. That stories weren't always in books. That sometimes wizards hid truths in riddles, in movement, in silence. Ron turned to the hooded figure. "What's the game?" he asked softly. The figure replied in a voice like distant thunder, muffled by snowfall. "It is the game of choices." Ron stepped forward, watching as the pieces circled one another. It wasn't about winning, it was about understanding, and suddenly, with the gentlest flick of wind, the board shimmered and showed Ron not a chess game, but a memory. He saw himself, young again, standing beside Harry, laughing with Hermione, sitting at the burrow, sharing jokes with Fred and George, walking through the forest with Luna. All the people he had loved, had protected, had argued with. The game wasn't about moves, it was about moments. And each square was a decision, a choice, a sacrifice, a friendship. The board disappeared, replaced by stars. The hooded figure stepped back and faded into silver dust. Ron turned slowly. Behind him, the door to the common room shimmered back into place. The chessboard waited. The book had returned to its page, and the next move was his. The Gryffindor common room, as if exhaling from the dreamlike encounter Ron had just returned from, seemed to settle into an even deeper stillness. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, not as a flare of heat, but as if telling its own slow bedtime story. The shadows it cast moved like pages turning across the thick rug. Ron stood beside the chessboard once more, the weight of everything he had seen still quietly humming in his bones. The ancient book lay beside the board again, as if it had never left. But it had changed. Now, the page that once held his childhood drawing had faded to faint parchment, and a new page had emerged, a map of a different kind of board. Not quite chess, not quite magical runes, but something more abstract, like a pattern of memories, rippling outward in rings. It looked like a target or a ripple across a still lake, and at the center was his name. Ron didn't speak. Words would have felt too heavy. Instead, he reached for one of the carved pieces, the knight he had sacrificed all those years ago in the life-sized game during first year, and moved it gently forward. The moment he did, the fire dimmed, and a soft breeze drifted through the common room from nowhere at all. Candles flickered and bent forward like listeners leaning into a whispered tale. With that single move, the board responded. But not just the board, the walls, the furniture, even the staircase leading up to the dormitories creaked in a rhythm that sounded like steps, but not his. The castle, it seemed, had begun to listen, to remember, to play. Ron turned toward the fireplace. The portrait above the mantel, a depiction of a sleepy wizard holding a steaming mug, tilted his head ever so slightly and for the first time blinked. The wizard didn't speak, but he raised a hand slowly, deliberately, and pointed toward the archway leading out of the common room. Ron followed. As he stepped into the corridor, the torches lit ahead of him, one by one, as if guiding him. The stone underfoot no longer echoed with the usual firmness of the castle, but softened, like walking on quiet memories. Paintings lining the walls stirred just a little. Some yawned and turned in their frames. Others gave Ron brief, curious glances before drifting back into magical slumber. Then, as he rounded a corner near the fourth-floor landing, a curious sight stopped him. There, leaning against the wall, was a broomstick, old, hand-carved, its bristles bound not with twine, but with thin threads of gold that shimmered faintly under the torchlight. Tied to the handle was a small slip of parchment, fluttering gently. Ron approached. He read the note, "Use only when the path has turned." He smiled softly, shaking his head. "Typical magical riddles," he whispered, but he didn't touch the broom. Not yet. He moved on, the air thick with expectation, not tension, not fear, just that soft flutter one feels when they're about to open a door they've never noticed before. And soon, he did. A corridor Ron had walked dozens of times now appeared slightly altered. At the far end, where usually a dead-end wall stood firm, there was now a door, round, old, and made of wood veined with silver patterns that danced like water ripples. No knob, no keyhole, just a single square carved into the center, a chessboard square. Ron turned and, with practiced calm, walked back to the common room. The board awaited him. He reached for the rook, cool and slightly humming beneath his fingers, and gently removed it from the board. As he placed the rook into the square of the door, the wood softened like clay, and the piece sank in with a soft sigh. The silver veins lit up, curling and unlocking in slow spirals. The door eased open with no creak, just the sigh of old magic being gently disturbed. Inside was not a room, not yet. It was a bridge, a long, suspended pathway of softly glowing stones floating in a black void like stars paused in time. There was no floor below, no ceiling above, only the hush of distant echoes and the feeling of being suspended in a memory too old to name. Ron took a breath and stepped forward. Each stone lit beneath his step, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. And as he walked, the space around him began to form, slowly, softly, as though built by memory itself. Walls grew around him, stone and wood and tapestry. The bridge dissolved into a hallway, and ahead, through a grand archway, the quiet heart of the mystery revealed itself. A second common room, smaller, older, dustier, with furniture that looked like early sketches of the ones he knew, books stacked in corners. A single fireplace glowing blue instead of orange, and at the center, a second chessboard. This one was different. It was carved into the floor. Its pieces were immovable, etched into the stone like statues frozen mid-battle, and yet they shimmered. Ron walked to it, knees bending as he crouched to observe the carvings. Each piece had initials etched beside it, some familiar: HGLLNT, Hermione Granger, Luna Lovegood, Nymphadora Tonks. Others were initials he didn't recognize, but the pieces seemed to glow faintly when he whispered their names aloud. Then something stirred in the far corner. A small silver orb hovered there, like a remember-all, but swirling with deep colors: lavender, forest green, and starlight silver. It pulsed softly, as though waiting to be seen. Ron reached toward it, and the orb floated gently into his hand. The moment his fingers touched it, the room shifted again. Not violently, not even abruptly. It changed like a dream changes, subtly and perfectly. Now he stood not in a room, but on a tower's rooftop, overlooking a landscape that blended every part of the castle into a sweeping panorama. The wind was soft, the sky painted in hues of quiet dusk. The chessboard lay at his feet still, but the orb had turned to parchment in his hands. A message now glowed upon it. In the games we played, we hid more than fun. We hid the paths that would remain when memory faded. You were meant to find this, Ron. The game never ended because the stories never ended, and they still need you to play. He stood still, the wind brushing gently through his hair. It didn't frighten him. It felt like coming home to a part of Hogwarts that had always existed, but had simply been waiting for him to listen. The orb dissolved into light, and Ron turned, beginning the slow, calm walk back across the bridge. The stones lit beneath him again, and as he passed, the old room behind him faded, like a dream leaving the edge of waking thought. Back in the Gryffindor common room, the fire welcomed him once more. Crookshanks finally padded into view, curling lazily near Ron's feet. And the chessboard? Still and silent. But beside it now sat a single piece that hadn't been there before. A knight, etched with the initials R.W. The morning after Ron's return from the memory-stitched bridge room was unusually silent. Even the castle's usual groans and murmurs seemed to hush themselves, as though giving space to something delicate, still unfolding. Sunlight filtered through the high windows in soft, lazy ribbons, brushing against the edges of books, cushions, and the chessboard where the knight with the initials R.W. now stood quietly. Ron stirred slowly from his bed, blinking at the ceiling as if trying to separate dream from reality. Yet, there was no doubt anymore. The board, the orb, the message, it had all been real in that quiet, enchanted way Hogwarts often delivered its lessons. Gently, mysteriously, in its own time. He dressed with a sense of reverence, each movement thoughtful. Today, he wouldn't rush. He wouldn't speak too quickly. Whatever this journey was, it asked for care. As he walked down into the common room, he found Hermione already seated in one of the armchairs, a thick book open on her lap. But she wasn't reading. She was watching the chessboard, brow furrowed, lips parted slightly in wonder. "You see it too?" Ron asked quietly. She looked up. The night piece. "It wasn't there yesterday." "I think it's mine," he said, settling into the chair across from her. Hermione's expression softened. "Then it's calling you." Ron nodded, then glanced toward the glowing embers in the hearth. "There's a room," he said after a moment. "A hidden one, with another chessboard, older, carved into the floor. It felt like a place where old games live on." Hermione leaned forward. "Did it feel safe?" Ron took a breath. "Not safe like a bed, but safe like a memory, like something meant to be remembered." Hermione smiled, gently closing the book. "Then we should explore it together," but Ron shook his head. I think it's just for me." She didn't argue, she understood, so Ron walked the halls again, but this time without the torches lighting his way. The castle had already shown him the path, and his feet remembered. When he reached the strange round door, the night piece in hand, it opened silently for him. Inside, the chessboard room was unchanged. Dust hung like soft mist in the quiet air. The silver veins along the walls pulsed slowly, like the heartbeat of memory. The orb was gone, but in its place now stood a row of pieces from the game, each holding a faint shimmer. The initials beside them still glowed dimly, a silent audience of memories. Ron stepped forward, placing his own night piece gently onto the edge of the board. The carvings began to shift, not violently, but with purpose, like a story being rewritten. The pieces arranged themselves in a new position, and this time the board whispered back. A light hum, a faint vibration, and then a drawer slid open at the base of the board. Inside lay a small wooden token shaped like a pawn. It was plain, except for a silver symbol etched into its base, a spiral enclosed by a circle. Ron lifted it, and suddenly he understood. This wasn't a game, not really. It was a map, a guide. Each move wasn't just strategy, it was memory. The pawn represented the beginning of something, a new path, a first step, and he had a choice. He could leave it here and close the door, returning to life as usual, letting the chessboard remain as a curiosity, or he could place the pawn onto the board and continue the journey wherever it might lead. He turned the piece over in his hand. It was warm, familiar. He thought of the message in the orb. The stories never ended, and they still need you to play. He placed the pawn on the board. There was no dramatic sound, no sudden light, only a gentle shiver in the air, like the quiet clap of a book closing or opening. The room faded around him again, not vanishing, but shifting. And when he looked up, he found himself no longer in the hidden room, but in the Hogwarts library. The restricted section, empty, quiet. Candles flickered overhead, and in front of him, resting on a small reading desk, was a book bound in faded maroon leather. The same silver spiral was embossed on its cover. He opened it, blank pages. But then, as he held his hand over them, words began to appear, slowly, like ink rising through fog. The board has moved. The players remember. The path continues in those who choose. He turned the page. Each piece must find its place again. The end is not a checkmate, but an understanding. Ron closed the book, heart calm but curious. The choice had been made. The game, or whatever it was, had accepted him. And yet, despite the mystery, he felt no fear, no urgency, only a soft, guiding assurance that this journey would unfold slowly, gently, and only as he was ready. The path wasn't meant to be rushed. Hogwarts, after all, had always known how to keep its secrets until someone was ready to hear them. Ron smiled faintly and turned to leave the library. He didn't need to know everything. Not yet. The next piece would reveal itself when the moment was right, and when it did, he would be ready. The castle felt quieter than usual, as though the air itself had turned a page, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Ron walked slowly through the shadowed halls, the maroon leather book tucked under his arm, its silver spiral glowing faintly even through the cover. It didn't hum, it didn't rattle or resist. It simply felt expectant. He found himself back at the Gryffindor common room, though he didn't recall how he'd arrived. The fat lady didn't ask for a password this time. She only smiled knowingly and swung open with the softest whisper of canvas against frame. Hermione was still up, perched by the fireplace, Crookshanks curled against her feet. A stack of books surrounded her, though none were open. She was waiting. "Did you find something?" she asked gently, as Ron stepped inside. He sat beside her and placed the book between them. "It's not really a book," he said, voice low and thoughtful. "It's more like a mirror, but made of pages." Hermione tilted her head. "A mirror?" Ron nodded, opening to the page with the fading ink. "When I hold my hand above it, it shows things. Feelings, lessons, pieces of something bigger, like the board itself. It's not teaching a game, it's teaching me." Hermione's eyes shimmered with curiosity, but she said nothing more, allowing Ron to speak freely, letting the room remain wrapped in soft silence. "I think it's been guiding me. Slowly, showing me that the board isn't just cursed or magical for fun. It's living, not in the way a creature is, but more like a memory is alive, or a story that remembers how it was told." He leaned back, watching the flickering firelight dance across the room. "It's all part of something older, a test maybe, or a ritual, but not dark, not dangerous. It's gentle, patient." Hermione looked down at the spiral on the cover. "And what's it leading you to?" Ron hesitated, then smiled faintly. "To myself, I think." The words came out softer than he expected, not boastful, not certain, just true. He closed the book and stood, walking back toward the fireplace. "Every move I've made, on the board, in the rooms, even what I've said to you, it's all been part of a pattern that reveals more than strategy. It reveals purpose. It remembers choices." Hermione joined him, her eyes now full of quiet wonder. "Then what's the next move?" Ron looked toward the mantel, where the enchanted chessboard sat as still as stone. But now, the pieces shimmered faintly, not moving, but aware, waiting. "I think I need to play," he whispered. And so he did. That night, Ron returned to the hidden room once more. The spiral token still rested on the board, and as he placed his fingers on it, the pieces rearranged again. But this time, a full game lay before him, black and white in perfect balance. And at the far end of the board, opposite his knight, sat a figure made of pale crystal, a king, alone. He sat before it, heart quiet. Each move was gentle, not rushed, not forced. The pieces moved like dancers through memory, and with every turn, a memory sparked in Ron's mind, not of battles, but of lessons. Moments in his life that had shaped him, standing beside Harry in the Forbidden Forest, laughing with Fred and George in the burrow, comforting Ginny after her first year. Each one folded itself into the game. The board wasn't testing his cleverness, it was reminding him of who he had become. When he reached the final move, a quiet checkmate, there was no trumpet, no swirl of magic, only a warmth that spread from the board, rising like steam from hot cocoa on a winter night. And then, the Crystal King shimmered and disappeared. In its place was a final message, carved into the board itself, glowing softly. The game is never about winning. It is about remembering how you play. Ron sat in silence. That was it. The board had never been cursed. It had never been a trap. It had been a mirror, patiently waiting for someone who could listen without rushing, move without ego, and remember without pain. Someone ready to be present, someone ready to understand. He stood slowly, cradling the board in his arms. It had changed again, smaller now, as if content to rest. No longer grand, no longer glowing, just a quiet game, ready for another player one day, when the time was right. He walked back to the tower as the sun began to rise behind the distant hills. The light spilled into the common room in gold ribbons. Hermione was still awake, her eyes meeting his without a word. Ron smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "It's not about finishing the game," he said gently. "It's about how we play while it lasts." She reached out, touched the board. It was warm. The morning air in Gryffindor Tower drifted in like a sleepy sigh, cool, still, and touched with the golden light of dawn. Soft beams stretched across the dormitory floor, lighting up the walls with a kind of quiet that only early Hogwarts mornings knew. It was the sort of stillness that made one feel like the castle was smiling in its sleep, breathing slowly through stone and magic. Ron stood by the window, the chessboard resting gently in his arms. It looked nothing like it had before. Gone were the shimmering tokens and mysterious carvings. In their place was a simple wooden board, old but polished, familiar and peaceful. The pieces were carved in soft, rounded shapes. No enchantments danced across them. No whispers echoed in the corners. It was just a chessboard, but to Ron, it was everything. Behind him, Harry stirred in his bed with a quiet groan, pulling the blanket over his face. Crookshanks stretched out on the hearthrug downstairs, his tail flicking lazily in the warmth. Hermione had gone to bed only an hour before, tucked into a quiet sleep with a book resting gently on her chest. Ron took a deep breath and slowly lowered the board onto the small table near the window. He set the pieces in their places, not because a game was about to begin, but because it felt right. The board, like him, was complete now, not in a way that demanded action, but in a way that invited stillness. He sat down beside it, resting his hands on the edge. His fingertips brushed the wood. The same fingers that had once trembled over impossible moves in life-sized games now felt only peace, A small breeze slipped through the crack of the open window, carrying with it the scent of dewy grass from the castle grounds and a hint of fresh parchment from the library below. Somewhere in the distance, the soft hum of a morning owl's wings passed by the towers. Ron closed his eyes. He could feel the rhythm of the castle settling into its morning breath, each corridor quietly humming with spells of comfort, protection, and memory. The magical world hadn't changed, but something in him had. The game that never ended wasn't about magic at all. It had been about listening, not to spells or ghosts or riddles, but to himself, to the spaces between moves, to the lessons whispered in spolvocus, quiet moments, to the strength it takes to wait, to the courage it takes to play without needing to win. Ron opened his eyes again, feeling the golden light warm his cheeks. He smiled, not a big, triumphant grin, but a small, soft one. The kind of smile that says, I know something now, and I don't need to say it out loud. Downstairs, the common room would soon fill with laughter, the rustle of cloaks, and the chatter of students heading to breakfast. But for now, the world was still, and in that stillness, the game continued, not with clashing pieces, but with calm understanding. Not with battles, but with presence. Ron leaned back in his chair and let his gaze drift over the castle grounds. Everything was as it should be. The Cursed Chessboard was no longer cursed, and Ron, the player it had waited for, had made his final move not by winning, but by remembering how to rest. So now, dear listener, as the lights in the castle softly flicker and the morning mist begins to stretch across the lawns of Hogwarts, we leave Ron sitting quietly by the window, his hands resting on the edge of a board that no longer carries the burden of old enchantments. The game has ended, but not in shouts or spectacle. It ended in understanding, in patience, in peace. The magic, as it so often does, didn't come from dazzling spells or ancient secrets. It came from listening to the quiet within, to the rhythm of rest, to the gentle wisdom of things often overlooked. A game that never ended had simply been waiting for someone to stop playing and start feeling. And perhaps that's the real lesson of this soft, sleepy tale, that not every mystery must be solved, not every spell must be undone. Some enchantments are only here to teach us how to slow down, to breathe, and to find beauty in the pauses between each move. As you lie there now, perhaps nestled under a cozy blanket, feel the warmth of Ron's quiet victory settle over you. Let your own thoughts begin to drift like morning fog over the castle grounds, gentle and weightless. Let the stillness stretch, unhurried and kind. There's no need to rush, no final move to make. The game is at peace, and so are you. Let your heart rest. Let your breath slow. Let your dreams begin. Somewhere, far beyond the walls of this world, Hogwarts stands still in the soft light of dawn. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sound of a chess piece clicking into place, not as a challenge, but as a lullaby, a sign that everything is exactly as it should be. You are safe, you are warm, you are welcome here, and now it's time to sleep. Good night, my dear dreamer, and may your dreams be filled with magic that listens back.